She was hired because she was the only planner in the city who had ever said no to a Whitfield. She was hired, 6 weeks later, because every other planner in the city had. Adelaide Verde did not believe in coincidences. Adelaide Verde believed, very specifically, in the kind of repetition that disguised itself as chance until a person with enough restraint turned up the volume. She was 27. She had not yet decided whether her restraint qualified as character or simply as exhaustion. The phone call came at 7:11 on a Wednesday morning in mid-October. The number on the screen was one she had not seen in 9 years. She let it ring twice. She let it ring 3 times. She answered on the 4th, not because she was ready, but because Margot Beecham had taught her, in her 2nd year of apprenticeship, that hesitation was a luxury only the unimportant could afford. The voice on the other end was not the voice she had been expecting. The voice was older. The voice was female. The voice was the soft, almost apologetic tone of an assistant who had been told to make the call with exactly the right amount of courtesy. "Miss Verde, my name is Teresa. I am calling on behalf of the Whitfield family. Our daughter Helena is engaged. The wedding is in May. The planner we have retained has, very regrettably." Adelaide set the phone down. She did not set it gently. She set it down with the kind of force that meant she had, in the space of 3 sentences, understood exactly what was happening. The planner we have retained has, very regrettably, withdrawn from the engagement. The reason given was unspecified. The reason given, Adelaide knew, was always unspecified in families like the Whitfields, because specifying would have required naming, and naming would have required accountability, and accountability was a currency the Whitfields had spent several decades refusing to mint. Adelaide picked up the phone. She told Teresa that she was listening. Teresa explained the brief. Teresa explained the budget. Teresa explained the cathedral, the guest count, the flower count, the band count, the bridesmaids, the best man, the rehearsal dinner venue, the honeymoon suite at the plaza, the photographer who had been booked in March, the cake designer who had been booked in April, the dress designer who had been booked in early autumn by a bride whose mother insisted on supervising every fitting. Teresa explained, in the careful order of someone who had rehearsed the conversation several times, that the groom was Lucien Ashford. Adelaide's hand tightened on the receiver. She closed her eyes. The cathedral bells of her memory began to ring in a sequence that had not sounded since the morning she had walked out of a law school library in Cambridge and had not looked back for 9 years. Lucien Ashford. Lucien, who had been 22 and insufferably confident and who had drawn her a portrait of a cathedral she had never seen, on a napkin, in a late-night café in March of her 2nd year. Lucien, who had held her hand in a corridor and had said, with the deadly precision of a man who already knew he was right, that she would become the most trusted wedding planner in the city, and that he would become the most trusted architect, and that they would build, together, something the world had not yet seen. Lucien, who had vanished, 6 weeks later, without a note, without a phone call, without a single explanation for the silence that had arrived, couriered by his own secretary, in a single sentence on a single page. Adelaide opened her eyes. Adelaide said yes. Adelaide said yes, thank you, please forward the brief. Adelaide said she would be available for an introductory call at any time the family preferred. Adelaide said she would make the drive out to the estate in Southampton the following afternoon, weather permitting, to meet the bride in person. Adelaide did not say, in any of these sentences, that she had once memorized the exact way Lucien Ashford took his coffee. Adelaide did not say that she had, in a previous life and a previous her, kept the napkin. Adelaide did not say that the napkin was still folded, in the bottom drawer of her desk, inside a leather wallet whose clasp had not been opened in 9 years. She said goodbye. She set the phone down. She pressed her palms flat against her desk. She breathed in, and out, and in, and then, for the first time in 9 years, she allowed herself to look forward to the end of May with something very close to dread and very close to joy. She took the drive out to Southampton the following afternoon, alone, in a coat the color of wet stone and a pair of boots she had not worn since law school. The drive was 2 hours from Manhattan, 90 minutes once you cleared the tunnel. She did not listen to music. She did not engage the hands-free. She catalogued, instead, with the precision of a notary, the inventory of every emotion she was not allowed to spend. She catalogued the napkin. She catalogued the library. She catalogued the corridor where Lucien had held her hand, and the precise pitch of his voice the morning he had told her that the cathedral he was sketching was not for any client but for her. She catalogued the silence. She catalogued, most carefully of all, the way the silence had arrived, because the silence was the only piece of evidence that explained why she had walked out of that library 9 years ago and had not, in any of the 9 years that followed, allowed herself to send a single letter. The Whitfield estate rose out of the hedgerows at the third bend of the drive. A shingle-style manor in the color of bleached bone, wrapped around a circular drive already occupied by 3 black town cars and a catering van whose branding Adelaide memorized before the wheels had stopped. Helena met her at the door. Beautiful, slightly too thin, slightly too rehearsed, dressed in a top the color of spring milk. Helena was gracious in the way of women who have been coached since girlhood in the choreography of graciousness. Helena was precise in the way of women who had been told, also since girlhood, that precision was a kind of armor. Behind her, on the curved staircase, Adelaide caught the silhouette of Mr. Pelham. Helena's father. A man in his late 60s whose handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds and whose smile did not include his eyes. He thanked her for taking the brief on short notice. He thanked her for being discreet. He did not thank her for being qualified, because in Mr. Pelham's vocabulary, qualification was an unspoken assumption. Adelaide accepted the glass of champagne. She accepted the brief in its printed form. She accepted the quiet courtship of a family that had spent several decades perfecting the art of asking nicely without ever quite asking. Then Mr. Pelham removed his reading glasses and gestured toward the far end of the corridor with the kind of polite authority that signaled, without requiring a sentence, that the next conversation was not for Helena's ears. He said his future son-in-law had asked whether the planner might be prevailed upon for a brief word before the engagement dinner resumed. Adelaide nodded. Adelaide did not know that her hands were cold until she crossed the threshold of the library and saw Lucien Ashford standing at the window with the posture of a man who had been about to make a phone call and had decided, for reasons she did not yet understand, not to. He wore black. He wore it the way certain men wear black, as though the material had been pressed directly onto his frame by a tailor who had been allowed only one fitting. His hair was darker than she remembered. The boy had been handsome in a way that had not yet learned to be careful. The man was handsome in a way that had clearly been studied. She walked toward him. He did not walk toward her. He set his phone on the mantel, straightened, and clasped his hands behind his back. "Good afternoon, Miss Verde." His voice was the same. She had forgotten, in 9 years, exactly how much that voice occupied a room. It pressed the walls outward. It lowered the volume of the chandelier. It made the small gilt frames along the corridor feel as if they were leaning in. He did not say her first name. He did not acknowledge her. He did not let a single flicker cross the hard, polished surface of his expression. "Mr. Pelham has asked me to walk you through the cathedral floor plan," he said, his tone so controlled it almost sounded courteous. He gestured toward a long table near the window where the architectural sketch had been laid out at exact right angles to the room. He moved. She moved. They reached the table at the same second. His sleeve brushed the back of her wrist. The contact lasted less than half a second, but she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum, a small shock that traveled a route she had thought was long since closed. He stepped back. He did not apologize. He pointed at the east wing of the sketch. "The ceremony will be here." He pointed at the long gallery. "The dinner will be here." He pointed at the side chapel. "The bride's mother has requested that her daughter's first viewing of the altar occur in private." His voice was correct. His voice was professional. His voice was the precise instrument of a man who had made a decision sometime around the time she had stopped returning his letters, a decision to behave in every room they would now share as though they had never met. Adelaide listened. Adelaide took notes in the margin of the architectural sketch, in a pencil she had borrowed from a small tray beside the lamp. Adelaide asked the right number of questions. And when he finally straightened and nodded once, not a thank you, not a dismissal, simply the end of a transaction, she realized, watching his shoulders move down the corridor with the careful rhythm of a man aware he was being observed, that he had not forgotten. He had simply chosen, very deliberately, not to remember. The contract was signed inside 36 hours. Adelaide's office became a war room with a coffee allowance that tripled overnight. White boards covered 2 full walls. Vendor threads in 11 cities. A florist on retainer in Holland. A leather-bound sample of the velvet that had been quietly couriered from a 4th-generation mill outside Porto. Helena's mother, a woman whose name did not appear in the file but whose preferences dictated 80% of the brief, had issued a series of increasingly specific instructions, all of them delivered through Teresa, all of them phrased in the soft, precise English of a woman who had been raised to believe that a sentence issued with sufficient courtesy could not be contradicted. The bride does not want pastels. The bride wants ivory. The bride wants ivory only if the ivory contains the slight grey undertone of an overcast morning in Antwerp. Adelaide wrote that sentence down verbatim. She added a single small drawing of a smiley face to the margin so that her assistant would know she did not intend to comply without a fight. Helena was gracious in their consultations. Always on time. Always carrying a small handwritten list of opinions she had clearly rehearsed. She was polite about her fiancé. She was precise about her fiancé. Lucien prefers a single floral note, not a blend. Lucien does not want the canapés to contain shellfish of any kind. Lucien has requested that the dance floor be widened by 48 inches. Adelaide heard his name the way a cartographer hears the name of a sea she knows she cannot chart safely. She charted him anyway. She built him into her days the way an engineer builds load-bearing walls into a house she knows she will eventually vacate. She did not visit his office. She did not request a meeting. She let every line of communication travel through Margot, through Teresa, through Helena again. It was, she told herself, professional. It was, she told herself, exact. It was, she privately knew, cowardly in a way she was not yet prepared to forgive. The first tasting was scheduled for the 3rd week. A private room at the back of a restaurant in Tribeca that had not yet been reviewed by the press. Adelaide arrived 40 minutes early. The chef was French. The sommelier was Italian. The pastry chef had once made a cake for a Saudi princess that had weighed more than most studio apartments. Adelaide had rehearsed the menu 7 times. She had not rehearsed what would happen when Lucien walked into the room. He arrived with Felix, his brother and best man. They were both in dark suits. They were both carrying takeaway coffees. Felix was shorter by 3 inches, broader by a shoulder, and he grinned, immediately, the moment he saw Adelaide. He greeted her like a guest. Lucien greeted her like a host, with the precise click of a man who had decided in advance what his face would do. He sat at the head of the table. He nodded at the sommelier. He tasted 4 wines in silence. He tasted 6 plates without offering a single facial expression that could be mapped by a stranger. Adelaide watched him the way she watched the floral courier's invoice when it was higher than expected, with the careful attention of someone who refuses to be surprised. The beef course came. He tasted it. He set his fork down. He looked at the chef directly. "Reduce the salt by 1/3, he said, voice immaculate. "Replace the tallow with duck. Add an acid note." Felix rolled his eyes the way only a brother could, the way only a brother was allowed to, in any room. Adelaide turned the page in her notebook. She wrote down his note. She underlined it twice. The chef nodded, thanked him, and left the room. Lucien did not look at Adelaide through the entire course of this exchange. He did not need to. His opinion had entered the room, had occupied it, and had not yet left. After the savory courses, the pastry chef presented a small tower of tasting spoons. Sitting at the end of the row was a single vanilla panna cotta with a passion fruit crown. Lucien lifted the spoon, tasted it, set it down. He did not move. For the first time that evening his expression cracked open by a single degree, and the room rearranged itself for half a second. Then the crack closed. He looked directly at Adelaide. He said, quietly, in the tone of a man returning a borrowed item, "The passion fruit is correct." He did not say the rest. The rest lived in the way his fingers gripped the linen napkin, as if he had been forced, by force of habit, to suppress the only compliment he had been prepared to give her in 9 years. The memory came back unbidden 3 weeks into the engagement. Adelaide was in her office at midnight, surrounded by 12 open binders and a half-finished cup of tea that had gone the color of cold metal, when her younger sister Cora called from Edinburgh. Adelaide answered on the second ring. She always answered Cora on the second ring. "How's the monster wedding?" Cora said, in the warm, slightly amused voice of a woman who had been fielding her sister's disasters since they were children. Adelaide stared at the velvet samples. She told the truth. She sat back in her chair. She closed the binder. She said, very quietly, that she had not been entirely honest with Margot about the identity of the groom. That she had, in fact, known exactly who he was for the better part of 9 years. That she had once, in a previous life and a previous her, memorized the exact way he took his coffee. That she had, in retrospect, perhaps owed him a phone call. That she had, in retrospect, definitely owed him the truth. Cora did not interrupt. Cora never interrupted when the stakes were real. When Adelaide finished, Cora said, in the tone of a sister who loved her but did not particularly sympathize with her, that Adelaide had been 19. That the call had been about their mother's diagnosis, not about him. That she had withdrawn because she had been terrified, not because she had not cared. That 9 years was a long time to punish both of them for a single, panicked decision she had made at 19. Adelaide had not cried in the office before. She had not cried in this office because she had built it, deliberately, to be the room where she did not cry. She cried now. She cried for the napkin. She cried for the corridor. She cried for the corridor at 3 in the morning when she had pressed her forehead against the cold plaster and could not make the words come out of her mouth, and the only person in the world she wanted to be proud of her was, 2 corridors away, already asleep. She cried for the boy who had called her 42 minutes later, in a tone so controlled it had felt like a blade drawn across the linen tablecloth of an untouched breakfast. She cried because she had hung up. She cried because the next morning, when she had tried to call him back, his phone had been forwarded to a number that had been disconnected 2 weeks later, after a transfer, after a country, after an entire rearrangement of a life he had chosen not to share with her. When the crying was done, she rinsed her face in the small powder room. She reapplied her mascara. She called Teresa. She confirmed the venue walk-through for the following Tuesday. She did not mention that the next time she saw Lucien Ashford, she would be standing 8 feet away from him in a cathedral rehearsal room, holding the bride's veil. The following Tuesday arrived with a cold autumn rain. Adelaide drove out to the cathedral at noon. It was a former stone chapel that had been deconsecrated, restored, and outfitted with underfloor heating that ran so warm it made the air feel slightly used. Helena was already inside, photographed for an online magazine, accompanied by her mother and her sister and a publicist whose name Adelaide had memorized because of the small scar above her left eyebrow and her habit of crossing her arms only when she was displeased. Lucien arrived 14 minutes late. He was in a camel coat. He was carrying a small leather portfolio. He greeted Helena with a brief kiss on the temple that lasted exactly the right amount of time. He greeted Adelaide with a nod that did not require reciprocation. He listened to the rector describe the procession order. He listened to Adelaide describe the dressing room logistics. He listened to Helena's mother describe, in considerable detail, what was and was not acceptable in the third pew. He stood very still through all of it. The rehearsal lasted 50 minutes. At the end, while Helena was being photographed near the altar, Adelaide stepped outside to take a private call from the florist. It started to rain. Hard. The kind of rain that arrives in a single sheet, as if the sky had been waiting for a cue. She stepped back under the eave and waited. Lucien stepped out of the side door at the same moment. Their shoulders nearly touched. The portfolio in his hand was open to a single page, a hand-drawn architectural sketch of the cathedral's east altar, dated 4 years earlier. Adelaide recognized the line work. She had watched him draw it. She had watched him draw it in a different life, in a different country, while she pretended to read and he pretended not to watch her pretend. He saw her see it. He closed the portfolio without a word. He stepped back into the rain without a coat. He walked toward the staff car at the far end of the courtyard. Adelaide did not follow. She did not call after him. She stood in the eave, clutching her phone, listening to the rain, watching his shoulders disappear around the corner, and for the first time in 9 years she allowed herself to understand that he had already forgiven her. He just had not yet decided whether, in this particular room, he wanted to. 3 weeks before the wedding, the friction started. It started, as friction so often does, over a color. Adelaide arrived at Lucien's office on a Wednesday at 10:30. It was the first time she had been inside the building. She had refused every earlier invitation, sending Margot, sending her assistant, sending the publicist, never herself. But Wednesday was different. Wednesday was the third color consultation, and Adelaide had decided, in the small hours of the morning, that she would not lose this one to a man who had no business choosing tablecloths. The office was on the 42nd floor. The elevator opened into a reception suite paneled in the color of sand. The assistant greeted her by name. The assistant had been pre-briefed. Adelaide was led through a corridor so quiet she could hear the seams of her shoes against the carpet. Lucien's office was at the end. 2 walls of windows facing south. A desk the size of a modest rowing boat. A single chair angled slightly toward the windows, because the kind of man who ran this office did not let visitors sit with their backs to the light. He was already on a call when she arrived. He gestured. Sit. She sat. The color swatches were already laid out across the desk. 48 of them, in stacks of 4, each stack bearing a handwritten label in his precise, architectural script. Ivory warm. Ivory neutral. Ivory cool. Ivory pale. He ended the call. He looked at her across the desk, and for the first time since the engagement party, the careful blankness of his expression slipped by 2 degrees. He did not say good morning. He did not ask about her weekend. He did not compliment the dress, which was gray, conservative, and chosen specifically so that he would not compliment it. You sent a memo suggesting the centerpieces incorporate the ivory pale, he said, his tone so controlled it almost sounded polite. Adelaide nodded. The bride's mother has asked for the overcast Antwerp. The ivory pale carries that undertone but reads warmer in evening light. The consultants had agreed. Lucien lifted the swatch in question. He held it at the angle of a man who had once spent 18 months studying light in a working cathedral. He set it down. He looked at her. Your consultants are correct, he said. The ivory pale carries the undertone. His voice did not rise. His voice did not soften. His voice simply delivered, in the tone of a verdict already known to the court, the exact sentence Adelaide had prepared to fight for. She had built 3 counter-arguments. She had rehearsed transitions. She had visualized herself, in the elevator that morning, calmly defeating the only man she had ever met who routinely defeated her. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She had been disarmed by the politics of courtesy. She nodded. Great. She reached into her portfolio for the next item. The candlesticks. He gestured. Wait. There was no edge in his voice. There was no request. There was only the brief, controlled pressure of a man who had decided, in advance, that the conversation would last exactly as long as it needed to. Have your team incorporate the lacquer finish I suggested in the brief, he said. Adelaide looked up. She had not received his brief. She had received 4 memos from his assistant. She had received 2 signed approvals. She had not, at any point, received a personal brief from the man himself. There is no brief, she said. He exhaled, very slightly, through his nose. He pulled open the top drawer of his desk. He removed a single manila folder. He slid it across the desk without releasing it. He looked at her. I drafted one in 2018, he said. It was for a wedding that did not happen. He waited. He let the words land. He watched her face with the careful, expensive patience of a man who had carried a folder for 6 years, had carried it across 2 continents, had carried it through at least 3 breakups he had not bothered to announce publicly, and had finally, in this office, on this Wednesday, placed it on the desk in front of the only woman he had ever trusted to read it. Adelaide did not reach for the folder. She looked at him. He looked at her. The clock on the wall ticked once. Twice. I understand if this is a conflict, he said. His voice was still controlled. His voice was still correct. But his hand on the manila folder had gone slightly pale around the knuckles. The rain had begun again outside. The color swatches sat between them, 48 small rectangles of ivory, each labeled in the hand of a man who had once drawn cathedrals and had not quite managed to stop. Adelaide did not open the folder in his office. Adelaide did not open the folder in the elevator. Adelaide did not open the folder in the back seat of her car, where her driver had been trained, by Margot, not to ask any question she was not invited to volunteer. Adelaide opened the folder on her kitchen counter at 11 p.m., 3 glasses of wine deep, wearing an old sweatshirt that had once belonged to her father, in a small apartment whose windows looked out onto a courtyard she had never gotten around to decorating with a single plant. The folder contained 8 pages. The first page was a hand-drawn floor plan of a chapel in Provence, executed in the same linework Adelaide had recognized in the cathedral courtyard 2 weeks earlier. The second page was a list of guest logistics. The third through 6th pages were notes on floral composition, written in the language of someone who had done extensive research and had, more importantly, done extensive listening. The 7th page was a photograph of a fabric sample, cut from a dress Adelaide had once worn to a winter formal in their senior year, a deep aubergine that had been discontinued 2 seasons later by the mill. The 8th page was a single line, written in his hand, in a date that predated the present moment by exactly 6 years and 3 months. Please forgive me. Adelaide closed the folder. She pressed her palms flat against the kitchen counter. She listened to the building settle. She listened to her neighbor upstairs lock their door. She listened to her own breathing, which had gone shallow without her permission. Please forgive me. Not forgive you for what? Not reconcile. Not meet me in some regret-soaked restaurant in the 11th arrondissement to discuss closure. Just the single phrase, written on a single line in a single hand on a single page at the bottom of a folder he had carried for 6 years, addressed to no one in particular and to one person in particular. Adelaide slid down the cabinet until she was sitting on the tile floor with her back against the drawer that contained the recycling she had been meaning to take out since Wednesday. She did not cry. She had done her crying for the year. She simply sat, and breathed, and held the folder against her chest the way she had once held a textbook against her chest in the 3rd-floor reading room while the boy 2 tables away did not look at her, and then looked at her, and then crossed the room in 5 long strides and said the only sentence that had ever, in her entire life, made her forget what script she was reading. In the morning, she arrived at her office at 7. She read the folder 3 more times. She called Margot. Margot listened. Margot agreed to take the Wednesday meeting on her behalf. Adelaide flew to Antwerp alone. She spent 2 days at the mill that produced the ivory pale undertones Helena's mother had requested. She inspected 14 bolts of cloth by hand. She selected 3. She hand-carried them back to New York in her carry-on because she did not trust courier services with samples that cost more per yard than a private college education. She did not, in any of these 2 days, send Lucien so much as a confirmation. She did not owe him one. She did not owe him anything. The folder was not a romantic gesture. The folder was a confession that had been filed, with extraordinary discipline, by a man who had spent 6 years pinning his regret to the inside of a drawer and had finally, in this office, on this Wednesday, decided that the drawer had become heavier than the room. When she returned to New York, the wedding was 4 weeks away. Helena's mother was in residence for a week of fittings. The bridesmaids had arrived from 5 cities. The cake was in pre-production. The invitations had been delivered. And Helena, who had been a model of composure for the entire engagement, had begun, in the smallest of ways, to falter. The first falter was the seating chart. Adelaide had proposed a long table of 82 guests, arranged in alternating family patterns that had been reviewed by 3 etiquette consultants and 1 historical society. Helena studied the chart for 11 minutes. Helena did not ask a single question. Helena looked at Adelaide and said, in a tone as flat as fresh ink, that she was not certain her father should sit within 4 seats of his second wife. Adelaide moved the father to a corner table, away from the second wife, away from Helena's mother, away from the publicist. The second falter was the dress. The dress had been fitted 3 times. The dress was a masterwork of ivory pale, hand-cut, hand-embroidered, and imported. Helena stood on the platform in the atelier in front of the 3-panel mirror and looked at herself for 30 seconds. She did not speak. Honora, in the corner, did not speak. Adelaide said, simply, that the dress was perfect. Helena said, simply, that she knew. The third falter was the rehearsal dinner. Lucien did not attend. He sent a note. He sent flowers. He sent a single line of apology written in the same architectural script that had labeled the swatches in his office. Helena received the note at the table. Helena set it down without opening it. Adelaide, 3 tables away, watched Helena's eyes brighten, then dim, then brighten again in a sequence that told Adelaide everything she needed to know about the rest of the engagement. The bride was no longer entirely certain she was marrying the right person. Adelaide did not say this out loud. Adelaide did not, in any professional capacity, have the standing to say this out loud. She filed the observation. She added it to the running catalogue. She continued planning a wedding that was, by every measurable standard, the most beautiful week any of them had ever spent. The Wednesday meeting happened 4 weeks before the ceremony. Adelaide had agreed to it at Margot's gentle insistence. Margot had not pushed. Margot had simply placed a cappuccino on Adelaide's desk at 8:30 and said, in the tone of a woman who had trained Adelaide from the ground up, that the Wednesday meeting was, at this point, professionally inevitable. Adelaide had arrived. Lucien's office had not changed. The reception suite, the corridor, the quiet. He was already standing when she entered. He gestured to the chair. She sat. The folder was not on the desk. The ivory swatches were not on the desk. The room had been deliberately reduced to the smallest possible number of variables. He did not sit. He stood at the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that had, she realized, not changed since Cambridge. He was still the boy who had stood at windows. He simply had a better view. The arrangement in question is the placement of my brother, he said, his voice quiet, his vowels exact. Adelaide opened her portfolio. The current draft, she said, places Felix in the second row, 3 seats to the left of the officiant. Given his role as best man and his relation to the groom, we had discussed moving him to the second row. He turned. He looked at her. For the first time in the entire engagement, his expression was unguarded. It was not soft. It was simply, very briefly, the expression of a man who had spent 6 years carrying a folder and had finally placed it on a desk and had watched the only woman who could read it fly to Antwerp instead of responding, and was, in this moment, prepared to accept whatever answer came back. "The second row," he said, "will be fine." He turned back to the window. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. There were no swatches. There was no folder. There was no review of floral composition. At the end, Adelaide stood. She closed her portfolio. She walked toward the door. At the door, she paused. She did not turn around. "Lucien," she said. He did not move. "The gray fabric is correct," she said, her voice warm in a way she had not allowed it to be in any room since the engagement party. "The 7th page. The fabric you held on to. It was correct." He exhaled. She heard it before she saw it, a long, controlled breath through the nose. She did not turn around. She walked out. She closed the door behind her. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall for 4 seconds. In the corridor, her assistant, who had been waiting at the elevator with 2 coffees and a small smile that meant she had heard everything through the glass, did not say a word. In the corridor, Adelaide allowed herself, for the first time in 9 years, the smallest and the most dangerous reaction to a man she had once memorized against her will. The rest of the week ran smoothly. Helena's mother continued to issue demands with the cadence of a metronome. The bridesmaids continued to be fitted with grace. The cake continued to be tiered. The florist continued to import from Holland. Adelaide continued to manage every detail with the quiet professionalism of a woman who had built her entire career on the principle that no one in any room should ever know what she was feeling. On Friday, the bride's father called. Mr. Pellin asked Adelaide, in the calm tone of a man who had built and sold 3 media empires, whether she could meet him privately at his club on Saturday morning. Adelaide said yes. Adelaide arrived in a charcoal suit. Mr. Pellin was in a navy suit reading the financial pages. He thanked her for her discretion. He thanked her for her competence. He thanked her, in a way that did not require reciprocation, for handling the engagement with the kind of rigor he had not been certain a planner of her generation could muster. Adelaide accepted the compliments. Mr. Pellin set down the paper. He folded his hands. "My daughter," he said, in the slow, careful way of a man who had spent his life selecting his words, "has asked me to speak with you." Adelaide set down her coffee. Mr. Pellin continued. "Helena has been offered, by mutual agreement, the opportunity to defer the wedding." Adelaide did not move. "The reason," Mr. Pellin went on, "is not logistical. The reason is that my daughter, who has been nothing but gracious in every public appearance and whose character I would defend in any room in this city, has come to believe, in the last several weeks, that the groom is not yet prepared for the marriage she has been promised." Adelaide did not move. Mr. Pellin did not name the cause. Mr. Pellin did not need to. He finished his coffee. He thanked her for her time. He thanked her for the linens she had quietly, at her own expense, replaced when the original shipment had been delayed. He thanked her for the rehearsal dinner she had managed despite the groom's absence. He thanked her, very sincerely, for the wedding she had been planning on behalf of a family that had, in the last several weeks, lost its way. He did not say what would happen next. He did not need to. Adelaide stood. She shook his hand. She left the club. She stood on the pavement for approximately 90 seconds, breathing in the cold October air, before she called Margot, before she called Helena's mother, before she called Honora, before she called Cora, before she called her assistant to cancel the next 4 weeks of fittings and to begin, immediately, the quiet surgical cancellation of a wedding that had been, by every measurable standard, the most beautiful week any of them had ever spent. The cancellation did not happen in a single phone call. The cancellation happened over the course of 72 hours, through a series of conversations so well managed, so quiet, and so professionally insulated that no one outside of the immediate family ever learned the precise sequence of events that led to the postponement notice that appeared, 6 weeks later, in the Sunday Styles section of the city's leading broadsheet, in a paragraph so brief it could have been mistaken for an obituary. Adelaide managed every call. She absorbed every cost. She negotiated with the cathedral, the caterer, the mill in Antwerp, the florist in Holland, the printers, the publicist. She did not charge a cancellation fee. She did not, in any room, take a single breath that suggested she had opinions about the circumstances. She simply performed the function for which she had been hired, with the precision and grace that had made her, 3 years into her career, the most sought-after planner in a city that did not bless second chances. On the third day, Helena called. Adelaide answered on the second ring. Helena's voice was quiet. Helena's voice was the voice of a woman who had practiced this particular call for several days. Adelaide, she said, in the soft, slightly amused tone of a woman who had decided, finally, that she was allowed to use her first name, I owe you an explanation. Adelaide said nothing. Helena continued. Felix told me, she said, in a rush, Felix told me about the folder. Felix had been at the Wednesday meeting. Felix had watched Adelaide walk out of Lucien's office. Felix had, apparently, carried a folder of his own for a number of years. Felix had known, the way brothers sometimes know, exactly what his brother had kept in the top drawer of his desk. Adelaide closed her eyes. Adelaide did not ask what was in Felix's folder. Adelaide did not need to. Helena did not say anything else. Helena thanked her. Helena apologized. Helena said, in the tone of a bride who had finally, in the last several weeks, allowed herself to think, that she had known Felix was the better fit for years. She had simply lacked the vocabulary to say so publicly. The call lasted 4 minutes. Adelaide set down the phone. She pressed her palms flat against her desk. She breathed. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She simply sat in the silence of an office she had built, specifically, to be the room where she did not feel anything she had not pre-approved. The next morning, Margot called. Margot had received, through channels Margot did not name, an invitation from Lucien. The invitation was for a single dinner, on the Saturday evening following the public postponement, at a small Provençal restaurant in the 11th arrondissement that had, according to Margot's research, been on his list long before the folder had been drafted. Margot did not push. Margot simply forwarded the invitation. Adelaide looked at the invitation for 47 minutes. She looked at it the way she had once looked at the photograph of the man she had memorized against her will. She looked at it with the small, sharp suspicion of a woman who had spent the last 9 years building a fortress of competence so immaculate that not even she could find a single opening through which to crawl. She picked up her phone. She did not call Margot. She did not call Helena. She did not call Cora. She called Lucien. He answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring now. She did not say hello. She said, in a tone that carried the exact calibration of a woman who had finally, after 9 years, found her footing, that the Antwerp fabric had been the right shade. There was a pause. There was a long, controlled breath on the other end of the line. There was the small, soft sound of a man setting down a pen. Adelaide, he said, in the exact tone she had heard 9 years earlier on a dormitory hallway phone, his vowels controlled, his consonants warm, his voice carrying the precise weight of a man who had spent 6 years carrying a folder and had finally placed it on a desk and had watched it be picked up by the only woman in the world who had been allowed to read it. I have been waiting for you to call me since 2018. Adelaide closed her eyes. She did not speak. Lucien continued, his voice quieter now, his vowels softer, his consonants a little less controlled. The folder was not a romantic gesture, he said. The folder was an apology. The folder was, in fact, the only apology I ever learned to write. The dinner, he said, would be at 7. The dinner, he said, would be at the Provençal restaurant on the 5th floor of a building he owned. The dinner was, he said, singular. The dinner was not, he said, a wedding. Adelaide listened. Adelaide allowed herself, for the first time in 9 years, the smallest and the most dangerous reaction to a man she had once memorized against her will. She allowed the reaction to last exactly 3 seconds. She ended the call. She opened the folder. She pressed the photograph of the aubergine fabric flat against her desk and she stared at it until the morning light came through the east-facing glass in clean, clinical lines that fell across her desk like the bars of a polite cage she had finally, very quietly, decided to step out of. She flew to Paris on the red-eye. She did not bring a team. She did not bring a portfolio. She did not bring the ivory swatches, or the candlesticks, or the floral books, or the folder. She brought a single dress, charcoal gray, conservative, the same dress she had worn to the Wednesday meeting. She brought the photograph. She brought a small notebook in which she had written, in her own hand, the sentence "Please forgive me." She arrived at the restaurant at 6:43. The elevator opened into a small room with a single table, set for two, in a window that faced east over the rooftops of a city she had not visited in 9 years and that smelled, in early October, of roasted chestnuts and saffron and the specific kind of cold that arrives only in rooms where someone has paid for it. Lucien was already standing. He was not in a suit. He was in a black sweater and dark trousers and shoes that had been chosen with the same architectural rigor he applied to color swatches. He had not changed in 9 years. He had changed considerably in 9 years. He was both at once, in the way only certain men could be, the boy who had crossed the room in 5 long strides and the man who had carried a folder for 6 years and had finally placed it on a desk and had watched it be picked up by the only woman in any city who had the vocabulary to read it. He did not greet her formally. He did not extend a hand. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said, in the exact tone she had heard on the dormitory hallway phone, in the tone that had not changed in 9 years except to soften by exactly the degree it needed to, that she was late. Adelaide laughed. The laugh came out of her like something she had been holding for an entire decade, a small, sharp, slightly unsteady sound that filled the small room like a bell. He did not laugh with her. He watched her laugh with the controlled expression of a man who had been waiting to hear that particular bell for the better part of a decade and was, in this moment, willing to pay for it twice. They sat. The sommelier arrived. The sommelier was not Italian. The sommelier was French, and he had been briefed, in advance, to bring a single bottle of Beaune from a vineyard Lucien had visited the year he had drafted the folder and had not known whether he would ever place it on a desk. They did not order food. They did not, for the first hour, discuss the wedding, or the cancellation, or the weeks of friction that had preceded it. They discussed, instead, the snowstorm. They discussed the dormitory. They discussed the third-floor reading room, where Adelaide had pretended to read and Lucien had pretended not to watch her pretend. They discussed the night of the department mixer, when he had crossed the room in 5 strides and had said the sentence she had repeated in her head like a hymn and had repeated again, almost as a confession, in the candlelight of the small Provençal restaurant in the 11th arrondissement whose 5 windows faced east over the rooftops of the city she had not visited in 9 years. "I think I am in love with you," he had said. Adelaide had not answered. Adelaide had pressed her mouth against his and had let the answer live in the part of her that had not, in 9 years, ever quite closed the door. Now, in the restaurant, he watched her across the table. He did not reach for her hand. He did not move the photograph. He simply watched her with the calm and the discipline of a man who had learned, the hard way, that the most expensive kind of patience was the kind that does not announce itself. Adelaide reached across the table. She placed her hand, palm up, beside his wine glass. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He placed his fingers, lightly, over her wrist, and the contact lasted less than 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds both of them understood, in the specific, expensive silence of small rooms in cities they had once shared, that the snowstorm had not been the storm. The snowstorm had been the first moment. The storm had been the 9 years between them. And the folder, drafted in 2018, was the only bridge either of them had ever managed to build. Adelaide did not speak. Lucien did not speak. They sat, in the small, expensive room, in the 11th arrondissement, holding the wrist of a woman he had carried in his memory for 9 years, and they did not speak, because the conversation had been, in some quiet, definite sense, finished the moment he had placed the folder on the desk and she had flown to Antwerp and had not, in any of the 3 flights, sent him a single text. The restaurant filled slowly behind them, with the soft percussion of plates and the low murmur of a city at dinner. The sommelier poured the second glass. The candle on the table dimmed by exactly 1 shade. The aubergine fabric, pressed flat against the inside of Adelaide's notebook, did not move. Outside, the city continued to do what cities do. The wind pushed the autumn leaves across the rooftops. The bells at St. Sulpice rang the quarter hour. The street lamps came on along the boulevard Saint-Germain at exactly the minute they had been scheduled to come on for the last 40 years. Inside, in the small, expensive room, Adelaide lifted the photograph from the table. She turned it over. On the back, in his hand, in the precise architectural script that had labeled every swatch and every line of regret, was a single line that had been added to the photograph at some point in the last 6 weeks, in a date that was not visible, and that read, simply, "Thank you for planning the wedding I did not get to have." Adelaide set the photograph down. She lifted her wine glass. Lucien lifted his. They did not toast. They drank, in silence, in the small, expensive room, in the 11th arrondissement, in the city they had once loved in a previous life and had finally, very quietly, returned to. The phone in Adelaide's bag buzzed once. Margot. Adelaide did not answer. Adelaide did not check. Adelaide simply sat in the candlelight, holding the wrist of a man she had memorized against her will, watching the candle dim by exactly 1 shade, listening to the bells at St. Sulpice ring the quarter hour, and allowing herself, for the first time in 9 years, the most expensive kind of reaction. She allowed it to last exactly as long as it needed to. Then she lifted her glass. She lifted it across the small table. She lifted it in the soft, deliberate silence of a room that had been, for the last 6 years, the most expensive thank you note she had ever been asked to deliver. The clink was quiet. The clink was clear. The clink was, in its small, definite way, the room finally, very quietly, deciding that the storm had been, all along, just weather.